forthcoming European elections in Scotland are going to be voting SNP?
Well, Mr. Speaker, what is always glaring from the benches of the SNP is their desire to overturn democratic decisions. They did it with the referendum in 2014. They want to do it with the referendum in 2016. And then they want to say to this House that a further referendum is one that they will abide by. Yet we know that if they get the wrong result, it will be 3 strikes, and yet again they will say they're still not out.
Mark Menzies.
Question number 2, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With permission, I won't be grouping. Question 2. I think on the order we have quite a few that are grouped today. I continue to have regular discussions with ministerial colleagues across government. As my honourable friend will be aware, we have pledged to commit the same cash total in funds for farm support until the end of this Parliament.
Menzies. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Export sales of organic produce totalled £188 million in 2016, supporting countless British jobs, particularly in the agricultural sector. What assurances can the Secretary of State give me as to the certification that protects that organic produce with exports to the EU after we leave?
Well, I know my honourable friend's constituency very well, as born and grew up, and he is absolutely right to highlight the importance of this issue within the farming sector. I'm very happy to give him the commitment that this is an issue that I know my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for DEFRA, is looking at. And he will be aware that this is part of a wider approach where we can take a much more bespoke approach to our farming needs once we are out of the European Union, rather than the catch-all, one-size-fits-all approach in which the Common Agricultural Policy applies.
Mr. Barry, Chairman.
Will outline what Canadians can expect from both the government and the private sector as it relates to the digital landscape. It will touch on principles like universal access and transparency, and it will serve as our guide as we craft new digital policy. Grâce à ce nouveau cadre, notre gouvernement élaborera des politiques qui auront comme objectif de rétablir la confiance des citoyens et de tenir les plateformes responsables. Parce que quand les gens ont confiance et lorsque les plateformes sont tenues responsables, chacun d'entre nous est en mesure de tirer profit des nouvelles occasions qui s'offrent à nous. Cette nouvelle charte n'est que le dernier exemple des nombreuses mesures que nous avons adoptées. Lorsqu'on parle de rétablir la confiance des citoyens à l'égard des technologies, notre gouvernement a déjà identifié des problèmes et mis en place des solutions. Le Canada est véritablement un chef de file à ce chapitre. Et on a fait preuve de leadership en ayant des conversations honnêtes avec les Canadiens et avec les grandes plateformes sur des questions comme les discours haineux, la désinformation et l'ingérence électorale. Hate and extremism are thriving online. I don't think anyone here would dispute that. Thanks to the anonymity of the internet, people can bully, harass, and intimidate nearly anyone who has a Twitter account. We're seeing more and more public figures and everyday citizens choosing to step away from social media accounts, silencing their own voices because the rhetoric has gotten so toxic. And who can blame them? It's commentary we wouldn't tolerate on our streets or in our public spaces. Platforms often facilitate and encourage this destructive behavior, and as a result, these same platforms have become a breeding ground for extremists. With the power of the internet, and through lack of proper oversight, the hateful can champion their views and incite violence from behind a computer screen and without consequence. And while these vile views live and fester online, they spill out into the real world with increasingly deadly consequences. It is our moral responsibility as leaders in government and in business, to denounce this hatred at every turn. We must stand united. We must fight back. Au Canada, nous n'avons ménagé aucun effort. Nous avons travaillé avec différents partenaires et avec les grandes plateformes par l'intermédiaire du Forum mondial de lutte contre le terrorisme sur Internet pour déceler et éliminer le contenu terroriste en ligne. Nous avons mis sur pied le Centre canadien d'engagement communautaire et de prévention de la violence qui vise à mettre fin à la radicalisation qui mène à la violence. Nous avons intensifié nos enquêtes visant les groupes extrémistes et haineux, y compris les groupes néo-nazis qui prônent la suprématie blanche. En 2018, le Canada a parrainé la première résolution du Conseil des droits de l'homme des Nations unies sur la prévention et la lutte contre la violence faite aux femmes et aux filles dans les contextes numériques. Et dans le cadre de notre dernier budget, nous avons annoncé un financement destiné à la mise en œuvre d'une stratégie robuste pour combattre le racisme. Ce sont des mesures essentielles, des mesures cruciales que nous devons prendre. Mais le travail ne s'arrête pas ici. Hate speech isn't the only issue permeating the tech world. Disinformation is also eroding trust between people and platforms. Facebook is by far the single largest source of online news in Canada. Articles and graphics are shared with a click, but more and more we're seeing that the content of those articles or the numbers in those graphics are either totally false or seriously manipulated. And what's worse, they're often passed off as the real deal, tricking people who don't have time to go down the rabbit hole of verifying internet sources. In Canada, more than 6 in 10 millennials admit to falling victim to fake news. And the people who spread that fake news take advantage of the same characteristics of online platforms that allow hate and extremism to fester. The deliberate spreading of false information is undermining both social cohesion and democracy writ large. In Canada, our Minister of Health posted about the importance of getting your kids vaccinated with the tongue-in-cheek warning that vaccines cause adults. Her social media was completely overrun for 2 days with virulent comments from anti-vaxxers, trolls, and bots. This is a real problem. So in Canada, we've launched citizen resilience and digital literacy initiatives so that people can learn to identify and resist disinformation campaigns. We've also launched a review of the Broadcasting and Telecommunications Acts to ensure that they reflect the digital era we live in, both in terms of opportunities and risks. But there's always more to do, and a lot of what's left to be done falls to the companies. The platforms are failing their users, and they're failing our citizens. They have to step up in a major way to counter disinformation. And if they don't, we will hold them to account, and there will be meaningful financial consequences. L'ingérence électorale est liée à ce problème de confiance et à la propagation de fausses nouvelles. Je surprendrai
The travel industry are all citing Brexit as being a major cause of concern in their sectors. Does the Minister consider this to be Project Fear or Project Reality?
What I would urge the honourable gentleman to do is to end the uncertainty and back the bill so that we can move on with this debate and so that we can get to the next phase of the negotiations. That will provide the certainty which the industries that he cites are looking for.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister reminded us that the Government has done economic analysis of a number of Brexit scenarios, but very pointedly, they haven't given us an analysis of the impact of the scenario that are going to ask us to vote for in a few weeks' time. But every analysis they've done of every Brexit scenario has shown that the economic damage to Scotland caused by Brexit is always made even worse if we also lose our rights under free movement of people. How does a minister justify imposing this additional economic damage on a country that rejected Brexit by 62% in 2016?
I fully appreciate the concern that members of the Scottish Nationalist Party have. They campaigned for 2 referendums, they got beaten in both of them, and now they simply want to rerun the result. The fact is, as this United Kingdom voted to leave, and this government, this front bench, is pledged to deliver on that referendum result.
Grant.
Well, Mr Speaker, I want the result of the referendum to be respected. I want the 62% of sovereign citizens in my nation to have their declared will respected. But doesn't the Minister realise that every time here his colleagues say Scotland has to put up with this because Scotland is part of the Union, they're driving another nail into the coffin of that Union? Doesn't he appreciate that his comments today will simply persuade more and more Scots that next week the way to protect Scotland's interests is by returning an increased number of SNP members to the European Parliament, and to make sure that in 2024 Scotland participates in those European elections as a full sovereign member of the Partnership of Equals?
My right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, was in Scotland last week, and the opinion in Scotland is very divided on this issue, as it is in the rest of the United Kingdom. And he will appreciate, as a Democrat, that the vote in 2016 was a national vote, a United Kingdom vote, and we are pledged to respect the majority result, which was to leave the European Union.
Furness.
Mr Speaker.
Any assessment, Mr Speaker, would depend on the counterfactual as to what it's measured against, and those were considered in the economic analysis that was put out in November.
Furness.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Many of my constituents in Sheffield, Brightside and Hillsborough contact me regularly with their wide-ranging views on Brexit. Can the Secretary of State reassure them that they would be no worse off if we did leave without a customs union and without the elusive trade deal the Secretary of State for International Trade has failed to deliver, despite stating it was the easiest in human history to negotiate? Yeah.
Well, there is nothing elusive, Mr Speaker, as to the actual text that is in the political declaration, and that makes clear that the government can negotiate the benefits of a customs arrangement alongside an independent trade policy, and the economic analysis shows that that is the best way forward of the options open to the government.
Thank
you, Mr Speaker. On Monday, the Secretary of State's 2 predecessors, 11 other former Cabinet Ministers and the chair of the 1922 committee wrote to the Prime Minister urging her, and I quote, to reject a customs union solution with Labour. Clearly many Cabinet Ministers agree with them. Does he?
Well, I've been clear throughout that we have an approach which I think is the best way forward. There are conflicting views in all the parties. There are, as he well knows, on his own front bench. We are discussing this with the bench opposite in order to try and seek a way forward on behalf of the House which will allow us to deliver on the referendum result. My position, if you ask about my personal position, has always been clear, which is we made a manifesto commitment in terms of the single market and customs union, and that was clear in the manifesto. But we are trying to look at how we deliver on the referendum result, and I think, as my opposite number would say, those discussions are ongoing.
Blomfield.
I guess that might have come close to a suggestion that he does agree with those who are opposing his Prime Minister's position. But this is, after all, the Secretary of State who voted with those 2 predecessors against his own government's proposal on extending Article 50, even after he had recommended it to the House. So I think we do deserve some clarity on these issues. The authors of Monday's letter also said of any agreement that is reached, quote, no leader can bind his or her successor, so the deal would likely be, at best, temporary, at worst, illusory. Does he agree with that?
Mr Speaker, it is not a revelation to this House that I supported leaving in the referendum, that I still support leaving, that I have voted consistently on every occasion to leave, that I have voted against extending, and I have stood by the manifesto on which I was elected. The question for the benches opposite is why they repeatedly, at every opportunity, refuse to stand by their manifesto commitments. Why is it they will not honour their promises that they gave to the electorate? So yes, I do support leaving. I support leaving with a deal. I've made clear that if we don't leave with a deal, then of the two alternative options, I would leave with no deal. My position has been consistent. Why hasn't theirs?
Daniel Zeichner.
6, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, this is a hugely important scheme designed to help EEA and EU citizens take up their rights and deliver on the government's commitment that we want them to stay. I meet regularly with colleagues in the Home Office to discuss it, and it's important to note that the Home Office has received over 650,000 applications so far, with thousands of more being received every week. Applications are free, and there is plenty of time to apply.
Daniel Zeichner.
Speaker, if the government really wanted to make non-UK EU nationals feel welcome and want them to stay, they'd make it an easy system. In fact, people have to have the right phone. If they haven't got it, they have to go to an ID scanner centre. And when you look at where they've been placed, look, they're all around London. So the Secretary of State's constituents and mine have to travel all the way to Bedford or Peterborough or London. Why isn't there at least an ID scanning centre in each county of this country?
Well, the Honourable Gentleman makes an important point about the accessibility to the scheme, and I agree it should be accessible. There are actually going to be 200 assisted digital locations across the UK to support people to register, including one in Cambridge in his own constituency. So that is something that he, I think, should welcome.
Kirsty Blackman.
Mr. Speaker, it's all well and good for him to say that there are going to be these centres, but they're not here yet. My constituents are having to travel to Glasgow in order to have scanning happen, because there's not an opportunity to go to that in Aberdeen. There's only a small library centre in Aberdeen. I'm incredibly concerned that particularly, and this has been highlighted to me, women who are fleeing domestic violence are being told that because their application is a bit more difficult, they are having to go all the way to Glasgow when they're already suffering from destitution as a result of the domestic violence.
I take on board the point the Honourable Lady has made, and I'm happy to discuss that with the colleagues at the Home Office. But I think with regard to a couple of different things here, assisted digital locations, there are scanning centres that she's mentioned. There's also the ability to apply via the Android app, and I know that my colleagues in the Home Office have been in regular talks to Apple to make sure that those applications can be made through their devices. So there are a whole range of ways in which people can apply, and for those people who are particularly vulnerable, there is also face-to-face support available at home to complete the application.
Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know that the Honourable Gentleman has consistently championed leaving the EU on the grounds of sovereignty, and the referendum was a call to reclaim the UK's sovereignty, ensuring that decisions that affect us are made by those who we elect. And on borders, free movement will end, with the Parliament deciding our domestic immigration policy in the national interest. On money, vast annual payments to the EU will end, and the UK will leave the EU budget. On laws, EU law in the UK will end, as will the jurisdiction of the Court of Justice of the European Union. All of this can be achieved by voting for the withdrawal agreement.
Kelvin Hopkins.
People voted in the referendum for the United Kingdom to be independent, democratic and self-governing. But the BBC recently broadcast a comment by the Belgian Liberal politician Guy Verhofstadt about the UK becoming a colony of the EU. What is the government going to do to avoid such a humiliation?
I think the Honourable Gentleman will recognise that sometimes some of these statements may be made to provoke rather than necessarily to inform. But what I would say to him is that we have very clear agreement in the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration of the UK coming out of and separating itself from the European Union. That is something that I think members across this House, bearing in mind the manifestos on which they should elected, should get on and support.
Philip Holloway.
The BBC documentary Brexit Behind Closed Doors was a devastating exposé of the incompetence of the government's Brexit negotiating strategy. It showed the contempt the EU has for the Prime Minister's stance, and has shown that the EU has run rings round us at every opportunity, with 2 exit dates having come and gone, despite over 100 assurances from the Prime Minister on the floor of the House. Isn't it clear that the simplest, cheapest, cleanest and most honest way to deliver Brexit is to leave with no deal on the 31st of October?
Minister.
Friend, but if he had voted as I and the Secretary of State have voted, we would have left the EU already.
Clive Efford.
Mr. Speaker, there's a YouGov poll published today that shows that indicates that a majority of people are not happy with the European Union and feel it may break up in the next 20 years. There is also widespread concern about the political elite, both at European level and national levels. Doesn't this show that sometime in the near future, Europe is going to go through major reform? And isn't it better for us to be there and be part of that reform? And so shouldn't we be considering now, in the light of the fact that there is not a majority in here for no deal, and there is not a majority for a second referendum, that we should be revoking Article 50?
I admire the honourable gentleman's honesty in terms of setting out his position clearly is to revoke Article 50. These are arguments that were made before the referendum. We had a negotiation with the European Union and we put that approach to the people in the referendum and said that they should decide. I think we should listen to their decision and follow it through.
Diana Johnson. Minister Quartey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In November 2018, the government published an assessment of the future security partnership as set out in the political declaration. The political declaration itself recognises the shared threats faced by the UK and the European Union, and it provides a framework to safeguard our security. That framework, as the Honourable Lady will know, covers law enforcement, judicial cooperation in criminal matters, foreign policy, security and defence cooperation in areas which we hope to have mutual cooperation.
And Diana Johnson.
Protecting our national security from organised crime and terrorism is, of course, the first duty of any government. And my constituents want to know that we will still be able to participate in the European arrest warrant and share criminal record checks if or when we leave the EU. So what further progress has been made on what was put into that political declaration so many months ago?
The Honourable Lady will appreciate that those matters are for the second phase of the discussions between us and the EU. And in order to get to that second stage, I sincerely recommend that she supports the withdrawal agreement. That is the only way, that is the only mechanism that we will get to the phase 2 of the negotiations, where we can discuss some of these matters which are critically important to her constituents and to the country.
Janet Davey.
Question number 10, Mr. Speaker.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I will seek to group question 10 with 11 and 12. DEXI ministers hold regular discussions with Department of Health and Social Care ministers, and we continue to do so.
Janet Davey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Nearly 500 people working for Lewisham and Greenwich NH Trust are from the EU. The Royal College of Nursing tells us 7,000 EU nurses have left the register since the referendum. With the numbers of trained nurses declining, what will the government do to ensure quality of healthcare in my constituency does not suffer if and when the UK leaves the EU?
Well, Mr. Speaker, throughout the period since the... Give me a moment. I'm actually going to answer with some specific numbers in terms of recruitment. As a former health minister whose portfolio cover workforce, it is an area that I've always taken quite an interest in. So if he gives me even a moment to get past the first 2 words, then I will, I will try my best to respond. I don't think it's a widely known fact, Mr. Speaker, that since the referendum there are now 700 more doctors from the EU 27 countries working in the NHS than there were at the point of the referendum. There's 5,200, over 5,200 more European 27 nationals working in NHS trusts and CCGs since the referendum. The Honourable Lady is right that we do need to do more in terms of nurse recruitment. There is a huge number of things that the department is doing, such as around the apprentice levy, such as looking at skills mix and professional qualifications, the investment of up to 20.5 billion extra a year in the NHS, a lot of which is targeted at improvements to workforce. So she's right in terms of we do need to look at nurse recruitment and how we strengthen that. But it is misleading to keep presenting to the House this fiction that since the referendum there has been this fall in the number of EU staff working in NHS, when 700 more doctors are working than there were at the time of the referendum.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 64% of medical professionals think that the NHS will get worse after Brexit. They haven't been fooled by a slogan on the side of a bus. So can the Minister explain why is the government struggling to convince those who work for the NHS that there's going to be a Brexit dividend?
I suspect this constant drumbeat of negativity around it does not help. But the fact is, we have committed to a 10-year plan. She should listen. She should listen to people like Simon Stevens, the former Labour advisor, the chief executive of NHS England. Look at the funding commitment that this government has made, a 10-year funding commitment, up to £20.5 billion additional of NHS funding. She should look at the areas of improvement to care and stop talking down our NHS. In terms of Brexit, then there are things, if one looks at the October 2017 paper, to protect in terms of the NHS. But it's time to stop talking down the NHS and look at the funding commitment this government has made.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I should declare an interest. I have several family members working in the NHS. As we've heard, there's huge concern about the lack of nurses, particularly specialist nurses who come from the EU. There used to be a recruitment programme going to Portugal where the training is excellent, particularly in intensive and post-operative care, and they can no longer do that. They used to recruit them because they have good care but not enough jobs in Portugal. That has stopped. In addition, medical research teams are in despair because they can't bring exchange their specialist researchers to further medical science. So can the Secretary of State reassure the medical profession that this is keeping him awake and that he has some response to that?
Quite remarkable, Mr. Speaker, is no mention of the 5 new medical schools that this government has committed to the significant expansion, record expansion in doctor training that this government has committed to the lifting of Tier 2 visas. The lifting of Tier visas, not just for doctors, but for nurses, so that we can recruit around the globe. They seem to think that recruitment to the NHS stops at Europe. And yet we recruit talent for the NHS around the globe, and we've lifted Tier 2 visas to facilitate that. This constant drumbeat of negativity from the Honourable Lady does not reflect the reality of this government's commitment to our NHS.
Froy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I also declare an interest in many members of my family working in the NHS. The NHS depends on tax and national insurance revenues. What is the government's assessment of the impact of leaving the European Union upon those tax and national insurance revenues?
My honourable friend is absolutely right that you need a strong economy in order to have a strong NHS. And that is why the option that is set out in the economic analysis published by the Treasury in November makes clear that the plan the Prime Minister has put forward is the one that delivers the strongest economy and as a result enables to make this record 10-year commitment of up to £20.5 billion a year more to our NHS, which is a sign of the commitment of this party, which for the majority of years that the NHS has been in existence has been run by government on these benches.
To say, and I hope she'll take it in the right spirit, it was most solicitous and indeed very courteous of the Honourable Lady, the member for Kensington, to notify us that family members work in the National Health Service, but for the avoidance of doubt, it is not necessary to declare an interest simply because one from time to time visits a doctor. Jenny Chapman.
Mr. Speaker, I was going to say that both my parents were nurses and that the Shadow Secretary of State's mum was a nurse as well, but obviously don't need to. I can remember being accused of negativity, as the Secretary of State has done repeatedly today, when we were warning of the dangers of privatising probation, and look how that worked out. It's our job to challenge the government. They might not like it, but that is one of the reasons that we are here. Public health is also potentially at risk from Brexit. Chlorinated chicken is a public health risk. How the Environment Secretary seems to think it is. How can we trust? I suggest he takes that up with the member for Surrey Heath. How can we trust this government to protect our public health or our NHS in any trade deal with the United States when they can't agree within the Cabinet? The Environment Secretary says it will be banned. The International Trade Secretary says it won't. Who speaks for the government on this issue?
The Honourable Lady is right that it is her job to challenge the government. Unfortunately for these benches, she usually does it more effectively than we would prefer that she does. But the reality on this issue, actually, I do disagree with her, because her party's policy is to say that it wants to have a say on the EU trade policy, even though the EU treaties do not allow it. So for many years on these benches, we have been told by the party opposite that we can't go into things like TTIP because it will be a threat to our NHS. That is what they have repeatedly said. Now they say, oh, actually, they want to pass control over our independent trade policy to the EU, and that it won't be a threat to the NHS. So once again, we have the benches opposite saying one thing when it suits them and the other today. There is no consistency on their trade policy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Department continues to work closely with colleagues in the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government to ensure that towns and communities across England are supported post-Brexit. The Government announced actually in March this year a new £1.6 billion Stronger Towns Fund for England, which will boost growth and give communities a stronger say in their future after Brexit.
Mary Robinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Earlier this year, the Government also announced £56.5 million will be made available to local government to cover the additional expenditure resulting from Brexit. It's important that councils like Stockport are prepared from day one as we leave the EU in order that my constituents can have uninterrupted local services. How will my honourable friend also ensure that as local authorities make their bids for the Stronger Towns Fund, towns and villages like mine in Cheadle are able to feel the benefit?
I'd like to congratulate my honourable friend for her tireless work representing her constituents and being a real champion for constituents up in the North West. Over half of the allocated Stronger Towns Fund will go to towns across the north of England. In fact, just over £281 million will be allocated to the North West region where the member's constituency is. There'll be further opportunity, I think, to deliver locally led projects, to create new jobs and to support the government's commitment to build a more prosperous economy across the United Kingdom.
One of the ways in which the government could start moving on regeneration, not just in England but across Wales and Scotland, Northern Ireland as well, is to set out when the consultation on the Shared Prosperity Fund will be starting. It was meant to be before December 2018. Treasury ministers don't know, Wales Office ministers don't know, Bays ministers don't know. Perhaps Brexit ministers can give us an answer for a change.
The honourable member will have observed that we have not yet reached a deal on the withdrawal agreement. Now, the Shared Prosperity Fund is the pot of money that will be allocated across the UK, once we have left the EU. We still have to have the withdrawal agreement, it still has to go through, and then at that point we recognise the importance of reassuring local areas that the Shared Prosperity Fund will be distributed. But it doesn't make any sense to do that ahead of the ratification of the deal.
First glove.
Team, Mr. Speaker.
Just kidding. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Revoking Article 50 would cause irreparable damage to the relationship between voters and members of Parliament representing them. It would reverse the outcome of the 2016 referendum, betraying not only the 17.4 million voters who voted to leave, but everyone who voted, putting their faith in our democracy at risk. Revoking Article 50 would break the trust the British people place in politicians, in voting and in democracy.
First glove.
Grateful to the Minister for that answer. And what steps are his department taking to maintain the faith of the public in the importance of their votes and confidence in this government delivering what it said it would deliver, particularly as we head into European elections that they neither wanted, voted for or support?
Minister. Ultimately, there are only three ways that this can resolve itself. The UK leaves the European Union with an agreement, the UK leaves without the agreement, or we revoke Article 50 and we don't leave. Not leaving with a deal is... leaving without a deal is undesirable, but not leaving is unacceptable, which is why the government maintains the position that it wants to leave the European Union with an agreement as quickly as possible, restoring people's faith in the democratic process and honouring the commitment we made in the 2016 referendum.
Mr. Speaker, next month it will be 3 years since the referendum. Does the Minister regard the referendum choice as binding for all time?
would he not recognise that at some point it is going to be necessary to go back to the people and ask whether they still think leaving the EU was a good idea?
The government's position is the referendum result is binding until it is delivered.
Jonathan Edwards.
Mr. Speaker, isn't it the reality that the biggest danger to confidence in democracy will come when the promised sunlit uplands fail to materialise? And therefore, isn't it the only way out of this mess now is to go back to the people and ask them to exercise their democratic choice?
The British people have already exercised their democratic choice. I don't subscribe to the negative predictions that he and others have made about a post-Brexit British future. But more importantly, international businesses don't agree with him because inward investment into the UK is still flourishing. The employment market doesn't agree with his projections because unemployment is still reducing, employment is still increasing. I am confident, the government is confident, there is a bright future ahead for this country outside the European Union. That is what we are committed to deliver, and that is what we are working towards.
Mr. Speaker, last week I was in Sibiu, where I made clear that we face common and evolving threats to European security. These threats demand close cooperation, and the UK has a leading role to play in that.
Fabricant.
My right honourable friend will know that the Bundesnachrichtendienst have already made it absolutely clear that the United Kingdom is one of the biggest intelligence services in the world, that it's a member of Five Eyes, and that Europe is dependent on the United Kingdom for intelligence, as well as our wishing to cooperate with them. Doesn't that make a complete nonsense of some members opposite who say that if we left the EU without a deal or otherwise, they're not going to continue to cooperate with us for their own benefit?
My right honourable friend is absolutely right that there is a shared interest between the UK and the European Union in close collaboration on security. He is right, not only is the UK the only member of the Five Eyes intelligence network, we're also the only EU country that contributes both its NATO 2% and its overseas aid 0.7% commitment. And that is why it's in both sides' interest to work closely on our shared challenges, because many of those challenges actually lie beyond Europe.
17, Mr. Speaker.
Additional EU exit funding allocated by HM Treasury to departments and devolved administrations cover all scenarios. No deal spending cannot readily be separated from deal spending, given the significant overlap in plans in many cases. HM Treasury, since 2016, has allocated over £2.4 billion of funding for all exit scenarios.
Despite talking up and legitimising a no-deal outcome for 2 years, the Prime Minister has now applied for 2 different extensions to the Article 50 period in order to avoid that outcome because she knows it's damaging to the country. He talks of £2.4 billion. Wouldn't that money have been better spent on the fight against knife crime, helping families struggling to cope with universal credit, or 100 other causes that would benefit our constituents, rather than an argument which, by the Prime Minister's actions, she has shown she doesn't even believe in?
Her Majesty's government has never had a policy to take no deal off the table. This House has committed government through votes to do so. He talks about spending in other departments, and we have seen record spending in the National Health Service, for example, making good on a commitment of this government. If he doesn't want to see any more money spent on no deal preparation, it is incumbent upon him to bring this to a conclusion, and the best way of doing so is to vote for the Withdrawal Agreement Bill when it's presented to the House, give this country certainty and the ability to move forward in a post-Brexit world.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In an op-ed in The Sun on Saturday, the Brexit Secretary argued that it would be inexcusable for the government to not use the coming months to continue to prepare for no deal. Indeed, based on his answers today, he'd no doubt like to accelerate those preparations. But as the public knows, given that they get advance sight of pending cabinet rows in their morning newspaper, the Chancellor of the Exchequer takes a different view. He recently issued an edict that no further Treasury money will be provided for no-deal planning ahead of the 31st of October deadline. When it comes to no-deal planning, can the new Parliamentary Undersecretary tell us who actually speaks for the government on this issue?
The Treasury has already allocated money for no-deal preparation. We are continuing to prepare for no deal because there is at the moment still the possibility that on the 31st of October the United Kingdom leaves with no deal. Members of the House who are uncomfortable with that position can take a no-deal Brexit off the table by voting for a withdrawal agreement, leaving with a deal which remains the government's policy. And if we were to do that, we could then move on to the second stage of the negotiations and set about creating a strong working relationship with our European partners and other nations around the world.
18, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We continue to work closely with the Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs on supporting our fishing industry. The government's vision for a sustainable and profitable fishing sector was set out in the Fisheries White Paper in July 2018. As an independent coastal state, we will control access to UK waters and pursue a fairer share of fishing opportunities for the benefit of fishermen in Banff and Buchan and across the UK.
I thank the Minister for his response, but can my honourable friend confirm that when we get a withdrawal agreement agreed, whatever form that agreement takes, we will be leaving the common fisheries policy, as he's just said, taking part in annual negotiations as an independent coastal state no later than December 2020?
My honourable friend is right, and what's more, he continues to be a passionate and persistent champion of the fishing industry in his constituency. The best way to ensure that this happens, and exactly what he said, that we are taking part in those negotiations by December 2020, is to vote for the withdrawal agreement, to do as he and I have done to secure those rights, and not as the SNP have done to try and trap us in the common fisheries policy.
Bambos Charalambos.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Question number 19.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The UK is a world leader in the provision of legal services, and English law has a reputation for excellence across the world. The political declaration outlines that the EU and the UK's commitment to ambitious arrangements for services and investment that go well beyond WTO agreements and go beyond existing EU FTAs.
Bambos Charalambos.
Legal services in the UK are a success story. The sector makes a significant contribution to the UK economy each year. The Law Society estimates that this is around 25.7 billion, 4.4 billion in net exports and 370,000 jobs. And this relies in part on the uniform market access across the EU and the EEA. So will the Minister work with representatives from the legal sector to ensure this is maintained by the UK-EU future relationship?
The honourable gentleman is a diligent member of the Justice Select Committee, and he's absolutely right about the importance of the UK legal services sector in terms of exports and its contribution to the economy. We've listened to EU leaders, and we understand and respect the position that the four freedoms of the single market are indivisible and there can be no cherry-picking. So while we are not seeking single market membership, we are seeking ambitious arrangements for services and investment that build on recent EU FTAs, and we're working closely with colleagues from the MOJ and engaging with industry stakeholders, including the Law Society, to achieve a deal that works for the UK legal services sector, both in terms of market access and in terms of civil judicial cooperation.
Topical questions. Bambos Charalambos.
Question number 1, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, since the last departmental questions in this House, the Government and the Opposition have held constructive meetings over the last 6 weeks. The Prime Minister met the Leader of the Opposition earlier this week. Discussions continue to try and reach a compromise that could command a majority in this House. The Prime Minister has also said that the Government will introduce the Withdrawal Agreement Bill in the first week after recess, which will allow more time for these talks to continue, but with a view to ratifying the Withdrawal Agreement before the summer recess.
Bambos Charalambos.
Can the Secretary of State confirm that the EU Withdrawal Agreements Bill will include the Government's proposal to legislate for the backstop in UK law?
So, well, yes, because the Withdrawal Agreement Bill will need to be ratified, and ratification includes the Northern Ireland Protocol.
Mr. Peter Bone.
Speaker. I wonder if the excellent Secretary of State has had an opportunity to watch Brexit behind closed doors. It's hidden away by the BBC on BBC4, but it's quite a revealing programme, sir, because in it, the lead negotiator for our exit from the European Union, Ollie Robbins, who I think is in Brussels this week, says because he's done such a rotten deal, he can't come back to the United Kingdom and is applying for Belgian citizenship. Is that appropriate, Secretary of State?
Well, Mr. Speaker, without straying too much into my television viewing figures of recent weeks, I must confess to the my honourable friend that I am intending to watch the documentary. I've seen clips of it, including the clips to which he refers, but as I think he'll appreciate with my diary, at the moment there isn't a huge amount of television time, but I will be ensuring that I do make time to watch that in the coming days.
Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In February, the Secretary of State told this House, and I quote, "The Withdrawal Agreement Bill is a significant piece of legislation and we will need to get it through the House. But the key issue is getting the deal through, because once we've done that, we'll have the basis for the necessary consensus in the House to approach that legislation." That makes sense. Deal first, implement second. So can the Secretary of State tell us, is the government going to hold a fourth meaningful vote before the Withdrawal Agreement Bill is introduced? Or will the House be asked to do the opposite of what he advocated in February and implement a deal that's not been approved?
No, I think, firstly, Mr. Speaker, I do not want to stray into territory that is quietly right, much more a matter for the Chair. But the Chair, I think I'm correct in saying, sir, has been very clear in terms of your directions regarding meaningful votes and what the position would be in terms of whether those would be considered. Now, in terms of the deal, we have also talked in terms of whether an agreement could be reached with the bench opposite. Those talks, as the Right Honourable Gentleman knows, are ongoing, including the discussion between the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition this week. What we have made clear, and what the Prime Minister has made clear, is that we will bring the withdrawal agreement legislation to the House the week after recess, and the House will get an opportunity to vote at that point.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I thought it's patently clear that if the Prime Minister's deal is put for a fourth time, if it's allowed, it will fail just as it's failed 3 times already. But I want to make it clear that Labour opposes the idea of passing the Withdrawal Agreement Bill without an agreed deal. That would put the cart before the horse, and Labour will vote against at second reading on that basis. So how on earth does the Secretary think that a bill to implement a deal that isn't before the House can pass in 2 weeks' time? Or is this about keeping the Prime Minister in office for another week to give her a lifeline for today's meeting at the 22 Committee?
But I mean, we have been clear, and I think these talks now with the bench opposite have been going on for over 6 weeks. We've been clear that the House has looked at the meaningful votes now on 3 occasions and made it clear its view. The question, therefore, and it came through from amendments from a number of members of this House, such as the Snell-Nandy amendment, to take one example, as to whether there were changes to the Withdrawal Agreement Bill which would enable it to command a wider body of support. And it is on that basis that not only have we had those discussions, but indeed he has welcomed those discussions. Now, it will be an issue for the House to decide when it sees that legislation whether it does command a majority of the House. Now, it may be that his personal position is that it's irrelevant what is in that text, because he personally wants to have a second referendum. Now, that's not the basis on which the discussions have been held. That may be his personal position. It is not, as I understand it, the official position of the Leader of the Opposition. But it will be for the House to make a decision, and what the Prime Minister has made clear is there will be an opportunity to do that the week after recess.
Mr. Philip Oliver.
The Secretary of State looks physically fit, he's in good shape, and I expect he goes to the gym a lot. If he decided to leave his gym and the gym said to him, "You've got to give us 2 years' notice, When you leave, you have to pay 4 years' worth of membership fees up front, and after you've left, we're still going to control your fitness programme. Would you regard that as a good deal or a bad deal?
Well, I fear that, Mr. Speaker, we're straying into slightly territory that's not primarily relevant to the legislation on which we'll be considering beyond recess. My television viewing is a bit like my gym viewing, a little non-existent at present. But the point is, we now, as a House, need to confront not just the issue of the legislation in the withdrawal agreement, but what the consequences are that flow. And when I gave evidence to the Lord Select Committee yesterday, in the usual lots of, sort of joyful comments of which my social media feeds are very accustomed, people seem to be surprised that if you do not leave the European Union with a deal, then the House will need to face a choice as to whether it then leaves without a deal or whether members of this House, as they have done with no deal before, seek to prevent that and seek to revoke such an outcome. I don't think that is a revelation, Mr. Speaker. It seemed to be greeted as a revelation. I think it is simply a statement of fact and logic. And members of the House need to confront that when they consider the withdrawal agreement bill that comes before the House after recess.
Cunningham. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's 3 years since the EU referendum, and the chemical industry on Teesside and beyond are still nervous about the future, and this is having a major impact on jobs and investment. Time and again I've raised this issue with ministers, and time and again they've failed to provide the assurances needed. What's the Brexit Secretary got to say now?
With your permission, I'm very pleased that the honourable gentleman raised this. I visited not exactly his constituency, but I've been to Teesport. I've seen many representatives of the chemicals industry. And the one thing that they are very anxious to do is to create some certainty. They want this phase of the Brexit process to be completed, and they feel that we should actually back the deal and back the withdrawal agreement. They have accepted, unlike many members on the party opposite, they have accepted the result of the referendum and they want to move forward with this process.
Jeremy Lefroy.
Mr. Speaker, what preparations has the government made to establish a UK investment bank to take over the responsibilities and functions of the European Investment Bank, and indeed to do more than that for investment in the infrastructure and businesses of the UK?
Your friend raises an important point. As the Treasury have set out, there will be extra support for the British Business Bank to play a role in that regard. But I'd also point him towards the important role of the UK Share Prosperity Fund in replacing elements of structural funding.
Grady.
Secretary of State earlier said that a no-deal scenario would be harmful to the economy and threaten the integrity of the United Kingdom. But then he also said he would support a no-deal scenario rather than rather than remaining in the European Union. So is he saying that the integrity of the Union, threatening the integrity of the Union of the United Kingdom, is actually a price worth paying for a hard Tory Brexit?
Well, what I'm saying is there will be consequences to both options. Revoke the betrayal of democracy, going back on the commitments that this House has given, having a divisive but not decisive second referendum, which may simply end up with the same result as before. The uncertainties of businesses, such as in Dundee, whereas on Thursday, the fastest growing Chamber of Commerce in the United Kingdom, where people want to see a deal and want to see this country move forward. That is the way forward. But if we don't support a deal, then a no deal does have consequences, but the much more severe consequences are the consequences to our democracy in this country, but also our international reputation as a country that has undermined a major democratic decision.
Martin Vickers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Is planning still continuing for a no-deal situation, and is the Treasury providing adequate resources?
I can absolutely confirm to my honourable friend that planning is continuing for no deal. Funding is allocated, and I think it is important as a government that we use the time that we have between now and the 31st of October to ensure we are prepared should that eventuality arise. But it is in our interest to secure a deal so it becomes unnecessary.
Norris.
Mr. Speaker, Nottingham has 2 world-class universities, and EU nationals on the academic staff and the student body make an extraordinary contribution to these schools. Can the Secretary of State give a categorical assurance that, however Brexit is resolved, there will not be extra burdens impairing the contribution of EU nationals to these institutions?
Well, EU nationals play a really important part in all our universities, and I regularly meet with the universities sector to describe them. We will absolutely continue to welcome EU nationals to study at our universities after Brexit, but of course, part of the arrangements between us will depend on the future relationship and the next phase of negotiations. I want to move on so we can secure the best possible future relationship for our universities.
Mr. Speaker, could he set out for the House why the customs union is the wrong policy choice for the future success of the UK economy?
Well, because, as indeed we set out in our manifesto, I think it is in the interest of this country to have an independent trade policy. That is what the Prime Minister has negotiated, and that is the best way of us delivering the global vision, which is why he and I supported Brexit in the first place.
Chapman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure the whole government front bench will be aware of the very bad news from Thomas Cook today, whose travel business looks unsustainable due to this Brexit process. Mr. Speaker, there's no such thing as a good Brexit, and we can only imagine the economic disaster of a madcap no-deal Brexit. Before the European elections next week, will he confirm that he will respect the views of this House and take a no-deal Brexit off the table? Absolutely.
Firstly, Mr. Speaker, any news regarding an individual company is always concerning, in particular because our minds turn to the staff of those companies and their families who are dealing with that. And that is an area where traditionally I think the parties come together and work together to try and resolve that. But I think we should not take these things out of context. It's only this week that we had the lowest unemployment since 1974, and I think that is an indication of the economic strength. And when bad news is always blamed on Brexit, as some on the benches opposite seem to want to do, it is worth always just remembering, Mr. Speaker, that we haven't yet left.
Mr. Chairman.
Speaker, will the Secretary of State assure me that he has read the major piece of research led by King's College London and Sheffield University, but universities across Europe, into the impact of leaving the EU on any basis on communities? And is he worried, as I am, dreadfully worried, that many of the hardest hit will be those towns and cities who voted to leave? And many people predict out of these figures a 20% cut in GDP, which would turn them into investment and employment wastelands.
So, what he seems to be saying is that the people in those communities that voted to leave should not be trusted with their vote. That's not what he says at the general election when those same communities return Labour MPs. He doesn't say that when they look at the economic policy of the leader of the opposition, they are too stupid to be trusted with their vote. And yet he seems to say that when it comes to the biggest vote in our country's history, that vote should be respected.
Earlier this month, the House declared unanimously a climate change emergency. Does the Secretary of State agree that when it comes to tackling the catastrophe which is climate change, or for that matter, challenging the overweening arrogance of the tech giants, or protecting our citizens, we are stronger and have more influence as a consequence of international agreements, and that they therefore enhance rather than diminish our sovereignty?
I think I agree with every word of what you just said, and I think that is one of the reasons why we're seeking to secure the international agreement that we've already negotiated with the European Union to allow for an orderly withdrawal, one which will allow us to work together effectively on these issues in the future, as we see indeed our Prime Minister has been in European capitals this week, working collaboratively with other European countries.
The Minister knows that the government's myopic obsession with ending freedom of movement is causing a recruitment crisis in the health and social care sector. Indeed, the King's Fund said recently that it was becoming a national emergency. Why is his government determined to drag this sector into that national emergency?
I think the only myopic obsession, Mr. Speaker, is the SNP's obsession with an independent referendum. But I mean, again, he says it's the government's obsession. It is the MEC, the Migration Advisory Council, that has said that this is a UK-wide issue and needs to be approached on a UK-wide basis. And I just remind the House of the answer I gave earlier, that there are now 700 more doctors working from EU 27 countries in the NHS than there were at the time of the referendum. The numbers are going up, and yet he constantly talks our country down.
Absolutely right.
Order. I have to notify the House, in accordance with the Royal Assent Act 1967, that Her Majesty has signified her royal assent to the following acts. Offensive Weapons Act 2019, Mental Capacity Amendment Act 2019. Order. Before I call the Right Honourable Gentleman Member for Raleigh and Wickford to ask his urgent question, I remind Honourable and Right Honourable Members that, under the House's long-standing resolution on matters sub judice, they must not make reference to individual cases currently before the courts. Urgent question, Mr. Mark Francois.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. To ask the Secretary of State for Defence if she will outline the government's plans for dealing with legacy issues and the investigation of veterans who served in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. Minister John Penrose.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I begin with an apology, because as everyone will have doubtless observed by now, I am not the Secretary of State for Defence. I don't have her hair. I'm very jealous of that. But I just wanted to explain that the reason why there's been some toing and froing since the terms of the UQ were first became clear in the course of the last hour. And the reason why I'm here is because we have concluded, at least for the moment, that it would be better to try and respond to my honourable friend's comments about soldiers serving in Northern Ireland, and obviously the Northern Ireland Office addresses that directly, particularly because the rules were different when soldiers were serving in Northern Ireland. They were there in support of the police, in support of civil powers, and those are different. Obviously, it's a different legal basis than if they are fighting abroad under other kinds of conflict. And therefore, I will endeavour to be as helpful as I can to my honourable friend about this. If he has any remaining questions which he wants to address, I'm very happy to follow them through with him later on. But let me at least try and address the burden of his urgent question right here as it's asked. And can I start, Mr. Speaker, by saying I strongly agree, and I suspect that everybody on all sides of the House will strongly agree that my honourable friend is absolutely right, that the current system, the current situation in Northern Ireland is not working properly for people on all sides. It is clearly unsupportable and it is unfair in many, many ways. So whether you are a former soldier or a former police officer, perhaps now in your 70s, who is worried about being pursued through the courts for events that happened 30 or 40 years ago, that is a constant worry to you and to your family and to your friends. But equally, if you are a member of a family of a victim of Republican terrorists, where the perpetrators were never brought to justice, there is a great feeling of worry, concern, and a difficulty in moving on all sides of the community in Northern Ireland, which my honourable friend is absolutely right, has to be addressed. And that is why, Mr. Speaker, not just the government, but also I think I'm right in saying that parties on all sides of this House and right the way across Northern Ireland believe that a new approach is absolutely vital to put this right. And that's why the original Stormont House agreement was announced some years ago now, and why most recently we have been running a consultation on views about how that could be taken forward. There were over 17,000 responses to that consultation, Mr. Speaker, which I think shows both the depth and the breadth and the intensity of concern about the current situation. We have almost, or pretty much have finished going through those returns to the consultation, and some trends are starting to emerge. We will, of course, bring those to the House as soon as we decently and responsibly can. But I think that one thing is clear to everybody, which is this, that everyone agrees on the aim. The difficulty here is that after, in some cases, 30 or 40 years later, after some of the events in the Troubles, we need to have a process which may have a judicial element, I'm sure it will, but will have to be broader than just judicial, which will allow all sides of the community in Northern Ireland to establish the truth where it can be established, but also which is fair to all sides in the community of the community in Northern Ireland, and which will allow people to move on, where they will feel that society as a whole can draw a line and move on. And while comparisons cannot be exact because the situation in Northern Ireland is unlike anything else on the planet, this has been done in other societies, famously, for example, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. That won't work precisely in Northern Ireland, clearly not, but some equivalent process, something which aims at the same outcomes, which allows people to feel that justice is being achieved, that truth has been delivered wherever it can be, and that closure can be achieved for all sides on an equal basis wherever possible, is essential. That matters particularly for soldiers who were serving in Northern Ireland, also for police officers who served in Northern Ireland, but also for the families and the grieving loved ones of victims as well. I will endeavour to respond to my honourable friend's further questions. I'm sure he has many, but I hope that at least helps to set the scene about where we are at the moment.
Well, Francois. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very grateful to you for allowing this in the queue this morning. There's been a great deal of media speculation over the last week about both what the MOD want to do and the NIO want to do, but yet we've had no information given to the House. So I put in the UQ this morning to try and achieve some clarity, and we'll see how we get on, sir. The Secretary of State for Defence gave a very confident and front-foot speech at Roos yesterday. I was in the audience. Frankly, it was an excellent speech. And she mentioned in her remarks her intention to try and provide legal protection, particularly for veterans who had served in the campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan. And we have seen articles in the Times and elsewhere to that effect, but thus far, I'm afraid, sir, we've had no specific details. If the press reports are accurate, then what the MOD are aiming towards is something along the lines of a statute of limitations, perhaps 10 years after a conflict has ended, in which no prosecution would be possible unless further exceptional or compelling evidence were to come forward. If that be so, the Defence Secretary would be honouring the Conservative Party's 2017 manifesto, which makes a nice change, and I quote from the manifesto, "We will protect our brave armed forces personnel from persistent legal claims which distress those who risk their lives for us, cost the taxpayer millions and undermine the armed forces." That is as plain as a pikestaff, Mr. Speaker. So if the Defence Secretary is going to do this, well and good, but we'd like more details. And one of the reasons this is so pressing is in terms of the persecution of Iraq veterans. The MOD set up something called IHAT, the Iraq Historical Allegations Team, which spent years looking into these cases. But unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, it became a racket. A number of law firms, one in particular, the ironically named Public Interest Lawyers, led by an appalling man called Phil Shiner, trawled Iraq to encourage people to come forward to make false allegations. Basically, they made some of it up. This all came out in a court case when the trial collapsed. They admitted they'd fabricated evidence, and as a result, my honourable friend and fellow member of the Defence Committee, the member for Plymouth Moor View, conducted a subcommittee inquiry of the Defence Committee into IHAT, which showed it was so shocking that the then Defence Secretary, the Right Honourable Member for Sevenoaks, shut it down. So we must, I'm sure the whole House will agree, never do that again. We then turn to Northern Ireland. And as the Minister rightly said, and as the Minister knows, I have a great deal of time for him, but perhaps slightly less time for his department. The Northern Ireland Office, under the Stormont House Agreement with parties in Northern Ireland, agreed to establish so-called legacy institutions to look into the past. The NIO's interpretation of this is that they will set up some form of commission that will go back to 1968-9, so 50 years, Mr. Speaker, and re-examine every fatality again. That's something like 3.5 1,000 cases. So any serviceman, any member of the RUCGC who fired a fatal shot will be re-investigated, but the alleged terrorists will not. Because under the Good Friday Agreement, Tony Blair gave them so-called letters of comfort, which means they are immune from prosecution. No alleged terrorist who's ever been given one of these letters has been successfully prosecuted. The nearest we came was the alleged Hyde Park bomber, and when he produced his letter of comfort in court, the judge abandoned the trial and declared an abusive process. So this entire process would be utterly one-sided because service personnel and members of the RUCGC would be liable to prosecution. Those with letters of comfort are scot-free. Now, Mr. Speaker, after the appalling, tragic events in Londonderry, we all want to see the Northern Ireland Executive re-established.